Who is this guy and why is he making such a pained face? This is Daryl, the creator and owner of Musubi, and he has that pained face because he's incredibly passionate about what he does. I was in Singapore this past winter and wrangled an interview out of Daryl. It's mostly Daryl speaking with a couple of breaks in there with me explaining some things that we talked about off camera. We agreed to meet at the iconic Raffles Hotel where Daryl has his office. The Raffles Hotel is a space that's truly befitting of Musubi. It's classic, elegant, and has an old-world charm and quality. I basically just threw questions at Daryl, and none of it was scripted, as you can see here. All right, hang on a second. I'm just making sure I got it.
I'm so bad on camera. Do I need to look into the lens, or is it more off-camera interview? I'm Daryl. I run Musubi. I try to be off-camera as much as is humanly possible, but I've been ambushed by Inky Rocks here who said, we should do an interview. I'm like, all right, so here we are. Shoot! Musubi is a social enterprise that is built around the uplifting and empowerment of disadvantaged communities. Now that sounds quite mealy-mouthed, so in practice what we do is we have a handbound division, which I think many of you will be familiar with, that does fairly expensive, very beautiful handbound journals, and these are all made in Singapore by artisans who have physical or intellectual disabilities, right? And we also work with a bunch of indigenous communities around the world. So we have a bunch of like Peruvian fabrics, traditional Japanese woven fabrics like kimono obi fabrics. And so the entire thrust of the business really is to use our platform to basically reach out to all of these communities around the world that are disadvantaged in one way or another, and to be able to take their products and sell it to an international audience in a way that makes sense, is sustainable in terms of employment, and sort of gets the word out about the kind of work that some of these folks are doing. The handbound division is handbound journals, right? They're these hand-sewn, hand-cased journals that we sell primarily to, I would say, the fountain pen community, and then also a bunch of like private clients.
Here's one of the handbound journals. This one is made from a Japanese silk kimono obi, and the paper on the inside is Tomoe River. It's beautifully boxed with a ribbon to pull the journal out. It's A5 sized with beautiful finishing details. It's incredibly luxurious in feel and includes a note from one of the artisans.
Then we have a more affordable line of Folio Notebooks, which are, round about the $25 range, and those are sold, they're affordable enough that anyone can buy them. And then we also do a bunch of stuff like pen cases.
These Folio notebooks have a real feel of linen and wonderful finishing details like these beveled edges. Daryl even talked about how the end papers were $1.25 and made by an old Japanese supplier.
So basically you either catch us at a pen show, which is the hard way to do it, or you go to the website at musu.bi, and that is basically the only place to buy a Musubi, because we don't have any dealer or distributor relationships. And there's a good reason for that, because with our social enterprise model, so if you look at, say, retail products, you'll know that it's usually about like 20-25% of the retail price is the cost price, and then the manufacturer makes about like 20-25% or 30%. They offer it to the retailer at like a 50% or 60% price point, and then the retailer makes the rest of the 40% and takes the sale price off, right? Our cost price, because of the way we pay our artisans, is really closer to 50% of the recommended retail price, right? And that's because under the accreditation scheme that we work with, at least 20% of our revenue has to be social impact generated. So I'll give you an example. We sell the basic handbound journal, say like your Segai journal. We sell that for I think about 90 Singapore dollars, 80 or 90 Singapore dollars, round about there. We pay the disability organization that crafts the journals $25. So straight up more, almost I think 30-something% of the recommended retail price. So the reason we don't have any dealer or distributor relationships is that straight up there will be no way to make the business model work. And that's why you can only buy the Musubi stuff direct from us through the website.
In order to maintain their third-party accreditation, Musubi must meet with a governing body once a year to explain what they did the past year and whether or not they had met their goals, and make new goals for the new year. And for their indigenous fabrics, they meet with the actual activists, not just something that they're buying third hand.
So the business has been around since 2016, so when we were past our 5th year anniversary, and now we're sort of thinking about where do we go from here, right? And so the handbound division is really going to focus a lot on very unique fabrics and really unique papers that that really showcase what the artisans can do. So in the January/February drop, there's going to be a very, very, very unusual diary that we are calling the Washi Washi Diary. And so that is, all I'll say about it is that it's washi on the outside and washi on the inside. And it's spectacular. We don't have a lot of pieces. You should really, really keep an eye out for that.
He was right. On their August 19th newsletter, they announced the Washi Washi, and by the time I read it, they were already sold out.
When we did the last customer survey in the newsletter, which you should subscribe to, by the way, because it's usually packed full of information, the two things that were asked for the most were a pocket-sized notebook and a B5 size notebook. And so in March or early April, one of those things is coming out, and you should keep an eye out for that.
And in the August newsletter, they showcased the pocket notebook with its really cool cover. These are still available, and I believe they're bringing them to the San Francisco Pen Show.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of exciting things coming in the rest of the year as well. This year there is a plan to onboard another indigenous community to the One Musubi stuff. So we're going to have a brand new indigenous community that we haven't worked with before, not the previous Peruvian communities that we worked with. And we're going to do a bunch of handbound journals based on that fabric, and it's going to be awesome, right? And that is as much as I will tell you in this video, because you've got to keep some secrets. So I do know a fair bit about paper, but really a lot of it is stuff that I've picked up over the years from working with people who are very, very good at paper, who are involved in like the manufacturing of it, in the sale of it. And so you pick up a whole bunch of things here and there, and I think naturally as you run a bookbinding atelier, you sort of like get to grips with the technical aspect of it. Definitely I would say that one thing that I've always been a little bit bugged by is that there is a lot of information out there on paper that is, I wouldn't say it's inaccurate, because most of it is actually accurate, but it's not. There's a lot of like, oh, this paper does this, but there's not a lot of good explanation why it does things the way it does. For instance, if you talk about, say, one of the big things in fountain pen inks is sheening inks, right? Like people love sheen and shade on their inks, but especially sheening inks. And really, when people say that a paper tends to produce more sheen on certain inks, what they're really saying is, for instance, that the combination of the sizing of the paper, which is the stuff that you put into the paper fibers that stops the ink from spreading, is actually sort of making the ink spread out in a certain way that it causes the scientific phenomenon known as thin film interference. That's fundamentally what sheen is. So the light hits the layers of the ink on the paper a certain way, and it creates this sort of like reflected and refracted wavelength effect that causes the ink to sheen. And so once you know that that's the reason why a lot of inks sheen, then you can ask yourself, oh, so what kind of paper would create a better sheening effect? And it would be stuff where the coating or the sizing of the paper is done in such a way that it forces the ink to sort of pull on the surface instead of going into the paper fibers in such a way that this effect produces itself. And so logically, the other thing that follows from that is, because the ink is pooling on the surface, it takes longer to dry because it's not actually getting into the paper fibers and getting soaked up by the paper fibers. So naturally, a lot of your modern, say, microcoat papers, like for instance, one of the big shading papers that just got discontinued is Cosmo Airlight, right? And Cosmo Airlight is really, really good for showing shading and sheening on your inks. But the counterpoint to that is that things take like an ice age to dry on Cosmo Airlight, and that's because it's sitting on the surface. Why does Cosmo Airlight function like this? Because Cosmo Airlight was never ever designed as a writing paper. It was designed as a paper for offset printing. So you were meant to use it with digital printing and offset printing for books. It was never meant to be written on. So you have this beautiful color and ink performance, but stuff takes really long to dry, and it's really garbage with hand oils, because it was never supposed to come into contact with anyone's hand or skin oils until the book is like ready and published and all the ink has already set onto the page. So one of the big things I want people to understand with paper is that you have certain performance characteristics, and as an offshoot of these performance characteristics, you have certain trade-offs that you need to make. So there is no such thing as a paper that is good at everything. There's a bunch of explanations out there that I think are good but incomplete in terms of like, why does a paper function a certain way? What are the technical aspects of a paper that make it work in a certain way? And so when I write our newsletters that are paper focused, I try to explain, why things work the way they do. If you remember back in, when was it, 2019, when I broke the news on Tomoe River changing over and my inbox exploded, that was really fun. One of the things that we talked about was the compressibility of the paper, right? The paper itself is still 52 grams per square meter GSM, but the newer Tomoe River paper had a thicker paper pulp layer and a thinner sizing layer, and so it was fundamentally less compressible than the old stuff. And that's why when you bound it into a book, the book ended up being slightly thicker, right? A lot of people conflate the grammage of a paper, so like 52 GSM, with how thick a paper is or how high quality the paper is, and that's fundamentally a mismatch, because if something is more dense but thinner, something that's dense but thin can have the same grams per square meter as something that is airier but thicker. Does that make sense? Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of this like technical stuff that I think a lot of folks in the fountain pen community don't necessarily talk about, and I would love if we could have like a better baseline understanding of how things work the way they do, because that would empower people to sort of look at all the papers on the market and go, oh, I'm going to use like primarily shading inks with this, so I want a certain kind of performance from my paper, so these are my good choices, right? And I want to use inks, but I also want to use pencils, so I need the paper to perform a certain way. So maybe I don't want to use like Tomoe River, maybe I want to use something that has a less aggressive coating or sizing on the paper so that my pencil lead will catch on it better. So there's a whole bunch of trade-offs that you have to make.
So you're saying
it's the combination of how the nib puts the ink down on the paper, and the paper itself has so many components that go into it, like there's the pulp, right? The combination of what goes into the pulp, right? There's the sizing, there's the coating, there's, for instance, like, has the paper been treated with optical brighteners to make it whiter, and does that impact the color performance of the paper in a certain way? There are all of these aspects. So really, instead of saying that, oh, there's one paper that's good for everything, what you need to do is you need to look at what your use case is and then decide what the best paper is for you in that use case, right? There's a reason why the Folio Notebook lineup with Musubi has like 3 different kinds of paper, and we're going to add more. Eventually what we want to do is we want to have like say 7, 8 different kinds of paper that are all each a different type. And so what you do when you come to the Musubi website is you go, oh, I have a certain thing that I want to do in mind, like I want to do quick notes. So these are the papers that would fit my use case, and you'll be able to buy those, right? TRS, Tomoe River Sanzen, is essentially a slightly modified version of the old TR7 Tomoe River that they have adapted to be more friendly towards things that aren't fountain pens. So it's more suitable for ballpoints and pencils than the old TR7 is. I remember having a really long conversation with the guys who run the Erasable podcast at San Francisco, and they were going on about how Old Tomoe River is actually not really good with pencils, and they're not wrong. It was never a pencil-oriented paper, and so for 2 guys who run a pencil-oriented podcast, it was like, this is not the paper for them, right? It ties into what we said earlier about finding the right paper for your use case. But the new Sanzen is different from the old Tomoe River. It performs differently with certain inks in terms of shading and sheening. I would imagine that people who are very, very sensitive to the difference in the performance of certain inks will notice. And I'm also fairly confident that there will also be a large swath of the fountain pen community who won't mind the changes, right? If it were up to me personally, would I have called it Tomoe River? Probably not. I think it would have been cool if they had just had the confidence to give it its own brand name as a paper, because it's really nice for certain use cases. Like it dries faster than the old Tomoe River, which is really nice. If you've used Tomoe River 7 for journaling and you've closed the page on yourself and seen the smudging and gone, shucks, I really should have let that dry. You know what I'm talking about. It actually does some really interesting shading things with a lot of modern, more aggressive inks, like your multi-chromatic shaders and all that, actually exhibit certain very interesting performance characteristics on Sanzen. So my advice to people would be, try the new paper out, compare it to Tomoe River 7. You may well be in the camp that decides that you can't stand the new Sanzen Tomoe River, and that's fine. And you may well also be in the camp that goes, wow, this is actually really nice and I like it, right? So I would say, rather than form preconceived notions of whether you're going to like a paper or not, like, try it out. There are ways to, you don't even have to buy a Musubi, that's not important. There are pads being sold, for instance, by Yamamoto Paper on like jet pens that have the new Tomoe River Sanzen in it. There's like loose leaf that you can buy from various vendors. Buy a few sheets, try it out with the inks that you like to use, and then decide for yourself whether you like it. Personally, I would say that I really loved the old Tomoe River 7, but if I were to choose like a daily notebook that I would write in very quickly, like say if I'm going for meetings with my designers and all that, I actually think the dry time is more useful than having the ink performance, because when I look back at my work notes, I'm not looking to see if the ink shades or sheens. I'm looking to close the book as quickly as possible and move on to the next piece of the meeting, right? So the dry time has actually been more valuable for me. So I would say that I currently use Tomoe River 7 for my own personal journaling, but if I'm bringing it to a workplace or a meeting, I'm actually using Sanzen, because it dries faster, and that's more valuable when you're out in the field or you're out at the workshop. So again, it's a use case sort of thing. It's a bit of a long answer, but it's more useful for a broader range of tools, and it's probably more practical in a bunch of disparate situations than the old Tomoe River was. The old Tomoe River is a good paper for when you want to sit down and sort of like really enjoy the color performance of your inks. And Cosmo Airlight's like that too, right? Where it's really beautiful, but it takes ages to dry, so you kind of want to take a slow hand and really go for it. I think it was Sharon in the Fountain Pens Oceania podcast who was talking about how like Cosmo Airlight is really good for a slow journal and
What?
for slow journaling. And I definitely agree with that. It's something that you need to take your time with, and it's really enjoyable. For a while, I was using a Cosmo Airlight 92, which is a thicker version of Cosmo Airlight than most of the options on the market, as my personal journal, and it was really gorgeous. But after you wrote every single page, you had to stop, and you had to stop for like a solid 2 or 3 minutes and let it dry. And so that's really good for a journal, but it's not so good if you're bringing it to the office, right? Because the work's not going to wait for you. Like when you talk about how paper has a bit more friction or a bit more drag, a lot of that has to do with, for instance, the pulp that goes into the paper, the combination of the pulp. So for instance, like Old Tomoe River 7 was eucalyptus and something or other, I forget offhand, but it was a combination of 2 different kinds of wood that made the paper pulp the way it was, right? Now obviously your big manufacturers like Nippon Paper are not going to say what the pulp is in Cosmo Airlight, so even if I knew, I couldn't tell you. But I don't know, and even if I knew, I probably wouldn't be able to say without getting a lawsuit. But the thing is that if you talk about, for instance, the wider line on Sanzen, it's probably due to a combination of the pulp and the sizing in the paper. I tend to use a stub nib, so to be honest, everything's fairly broad. So if you tell me that the line is wider, I'll take your word for it. I would say that in our testing, we have noticed that certain extra fine nibs do write a little bit wider on the Sunset paper than they do on Old Tomoe River. And whether you think that is better or not is really up to you. If you want to do like really fine writing, then maybe Sunset is not the paper for you. But on the other hand, if you love big, broad, juicy nibs, and you want your line to be as wide across the page as possible, then that might just be up your alley. Right? Line width is very much a personal preference thing, which is why all those nib sizes exist. Yeah. Is there something I would like to say to the stationery community? I think what I would love to say to people is that I think it is important in this day and age to try your best to be a conscious consumer when it comes to buying things and consuming things. I think we live in a culture where it's very easy to sort of buy as many things as possible. And I'm aware that perhaps the owner of a business should not be telling people not to buy stuff. I'm aware of the irony, but I would love it if people thought very carefully about the things they bought and sort of said, I'm buying this thing because I love it and it gives me joy and I really want to use it, rather than I'm buying something to stash away, right? When Tomoe River changed over, we saw a lot of folks who would come to the website and they would attempt to order like 20 or 30 notebooks of the Old Tomoe River. And look, I get it. If you really love the paper and you want to buy like 20 or 30 notebooks, I'm not going to stop you. But these things come and go, right? The machine that makes the paper is always going to get old at some point, and it's always going to break. And when they move the production to a new machine, it hasn't had years of paper pulp accumulation on the insides. It hasn't had all the parts haven't broken in yet. The performance of the paper is going to be different because it's fundamentally an analog product. So take a wide view of it and sort of accept that things change as time goes on, and just say, it's okay to love a thing, use it, and then when it's no longer produced, discover new things, right? Like, be a conscious consumer, don't overbuy, don't overconsume. And really think about where your money is going in terms of the companies that you buy from and the products that you like to use on a day-to-day basis, because we live in an era of immense climate change. We live in an era where a lot of disadvantaged communities, a lot of less well-to-do families are not doing great. They haven't come out of the pandemic doing so great. So I would encourage you to, for instance, shop at your local small business, right? Because they really need the help right now. I would encourage you to think about how much recycling you're doing. When you're finished with an ink bottle, if that's even possible for people these days, when you finish with an ink bottle, reuse it for other things or recycle the glass. That's a good thing to do. But in general, I would really, really want to encourage people to engage with the idea of conscious consumption. Just because it's perfectly okay for something to exist that you think is very, very beautiful and you love the concept of it, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to own it. Right?
As you can see, Daryl is quite passionate about his endeavor, Musubi. After my camera battery gave up, Daryl and I sat around and talked for quite some time afterwards. And I want to highlight that he really thought a lot about Leigh Reyes. Leigh was an early adopter of Musubi journals. I think she has a real eye for quality things. She was also an early adopter of Bokumondo Urushi pens. Daryl is also a big supporter of the San Francisco Pen Show and will be there this year. As a matter of fact, he said he'll be there every year. If you can't make it to the San Francisco Pen Show, you can find Musubi products at musu.bi.